You can practice the most updated Microsoft AZ-305 real questions to test yourself from this video. 1. You plan to migrate App 1 to Azure. You need to recommend a network connectivity solution for the Azure storage account that will host the App 1 data. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? A private endpoint. B. A service endpoint that has a service endpoint policy. C. Azure public peering for an ExpressRoute circuit. D. Microsoft peering for an ExpressRoute circuit. Answer: A. 2. You plan to migrate App 1 to Azure. The solution must meet the authentication and authorization requirements. Which type of endpoint should App 1 use to obtain an access token? A. Azure Instance Metadata Service, IMDS. B. Azure AD. C. Azure Service Management. D. Microsoft Identity Platform. Answer: D. 3. You migrate App 1 to Azure. You need to ensure that the data storage for App 1 meets the security and compliance requirement. What should you do? A. Create an access policy for the blob. B. Modify the access level of the blob service. C. Implement Azure Resource Locks. D. Create Azure RBAC assignments. Answer: A. 4. You need to recommend a strategy for migrating the database content of Web App 1 to Azure. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Use Azure Site Recovery to replicate the SQL servers to Azure. B. Use SQL Server Transactional Replication. C. Copy the BACPAC file that contains the Azure SQL database file to Azure Blob Storage. D. Copy the VHD that contains the Azure SQL database files to Azure Blob Storage. Answer: D. 5. You need to recommend a data storage strategy for Web App 1. What should you include in the recommendation? A. An Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool. B. A vCore-based Azure SQL database. C. An Azure Virtual Machine that runs SQL Server. D. A fixed-size DTU Azure SQL database. Answer: B. 6. You need to recommend a solution to meet the database retention requirement. What should you recommend? A. Configure a long-term retention policy for the database. B. Configure Azure Site Recovery. C. Configure geo-replication of the database. D. Use automatic Azure SQL database backups. Answer: A. 7. You are developing a sales application that will contain several Azure cloud services and will handle different components of a transaction. Different cloud services will process customer orders, billing, payment, inventory, and shipping. You need to recommend a solution to enable the cloud services to asynchronously communicate transaction information by using REST messages. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Service Bus. B. Azure Blob Storage. C. Azure Notification Hubs. D. Azure Application Gateway. Answer: A. 8. You are designing a microservices architecture that will support a web application. The solution must meet the following requirements. Allow independent upgrades to each microservice. Deploy the solution on premises and to Azure. Set policies for performing automatic repairs to the microservices. Support low latency and hyperscale operations. You need to recommend a technology. What should you recommend? A. Azure Service Fabric. B. Azure Container Service. C. Azure Container Instance. D. Azure Virtual Machine Scale Set. Answer: A. 9. You have data files in Azure Blob Storage. You plan to transform the files and move them to Azure Data Lake Storage. You need to transform the data by using mapping data flow. Which service should you use? A. Azure Data Box Gateway. B. Azure Databricks. C. Azure Data Factory. D. Azure Storage Sync. Answer: C. 10. You need to recommend a solution to generate a monthly report of all the new Azure Resource Manager resource deployment in your subscription. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Activity Log. B. Azure Monitor Action Groups. C. Azure Advisor. D. Azure Monitor Metrics. Answer: A.